In 1959, the body of Errol Flynn lay still in a quiet room, far removed from castle walls, crashing waves, and the roar of audiences who once believed he could never fall. He was only 50 years old, yet physicians who examined him remarked that his body bore the strain of a man far older, as though time itself had pressed harder against him than against anyone else. The image is almost impossible to reconcile. The same man who once leapt effortlessly across battlements, now undone not by an enemy's blade, but by the relentless accumulation of excess. How does a figure crowned immortal by the camera end in such fragile stillness? How does a hero built of light burn out so completely? To understand that ending, we must return to 1935, when a sword first flashed across the screen in Captain Blood, and audiences felt something electric and immediate. Flynn did not simply play a swashbuckler. He seemed to embody motion itself, daring, irreverent, alive in a way that made the frame feel too small to contain him. By 1938, in The Adventures of Robin Hood, Technicolor sealed the illusion of immortality. The grin that carried both mischief and confidence, the swagger that suggested danger without cruelty, the effortless authority of a man who handled a blade as though it were an extension of his own pulse. The camera adored him, and Hollywood crowned him eternal, sculpting his image into a legend of righteousness and charm. Yet immortality in Hollywood has always been conditional. On screen, Flynn was justice in motion, a hero who fought oppression with steel and laughter, a symbol of courage untouched by doubt. Off-screen, however, stories gathered with equal intensity: midnight parties, restless voyages, headlines that refused to fade, rumors that lingered long after the applause had quieted. Some accounts were confirmed, others remained whispers carried through studio corridors and across oceans, but together they formed a growing shadow behind the glow. The sword glittered beneath the discipline of studio lights, while the glass glittered beneath moonlit excess, and between those two reflections lived the real tension of his life. Hero on screen, chaos off screen, and somewhere in that collision, a man determined to live faster than the legend being constructed around him, burning with a brilliance that no body could sustain forever. When Errol Flynn arrived in Hollywood, he did not come with the polished gravitas of a classically trained leading man, nor the brooding mystique that had defined earlier screen idols. What he brought instead was velocity, a physical, almost reckless energy that seemed to defy the rigid architecture of the studio system. In 1935, with Captain Blood, that energy found its perfect container. The film itself was a classic adventure narrative, but Flynn's presence transformed it into something electric. He did not posture like a hero carved from marble. He moved like a man who might laugh in the face of danger and enjoy it. His swordplay was not merely choreography. It felt playful, instinctive, alive. Audiences did not simply admire him, they felt as though they were chasing him across the deck of a ship, breathless and exhilarated. By 1938, The Adventures of Robin Hood elevated that energy into Technicolor myth. Against lush forests and blazing costumes, Flynn's Robin Hood became the definitive swashbuckler, righteous without stiffness, romantic without fragility, daring without cruelty. The grin mattered as much as the blade. He carried mischief in his expression, a suggestion that heroism could coexist with pleasure. In an era when masculinity on screen often leaned toward solemn nobility, Flynn offered something looser and more kinetic. If Rudolph Valentino had embodied romantic longing in the silent era, Flynn embodied motion, a forward thrust into adventure that felt modern and immediate. He was not a distant idol to be worshipped. He was a companion in rebellion, inviting audiences to escape into forests, fortresses, and freedom. Central to this mythology was his partnership with Olivia de Havilland, whose luminous presence provided balance to Flynn's volatility. Their chemistry was not built on melodramatic excess, but on rhythm, her poise meeting his spark, her composure grounding his restlessness. Together, they formed a romantic ideal that felt both timeless and strangely contemporary, and their collaborations reinforced the illusion that Flynn's charm was inexhaustible. On screen, he seemed guided by an internal compass that always pointed toward justice, even when cloaked in mischief. The studio system recognized the alchemy and leaned into it, marketing him as the embodiment of courage wrapped in charisma, the hero who could disarm an enemy with steel and an audience with a smile. Yet, even in these triumphant years, the seeds of tension were already present. The very qualities that made Flynn magnetic spontaneity, defiance, appetite, were not easily contained within contracts and publicity schedules. The sword that glittered beneath studio lights symbolized control, choreography, and crafted legend. It was sharp, precise, disciplined, but beneath the legend lived a man whose vitality resisted confinement, whose laughter carried an edge that could not be fully scripted. The camera loved him because it could capture that vitality without consequence, freezing it into frames of eternal youth and agility. Hollywood crowned him immortal, sculpting his image into an archetype that would define adventure cinema for decades. But immortality, as history would show, was only an illusion granted by light, and celluloid and light, no matter how bright, cannot halt the passage of time. If the studio system excelled at manufacturing illusion, it struggled with men who resisted containment, and Errol Flynn was, from the beginning, a force that did not fit neatly within carefully drafted contracts. During the height of his fame in the late 1930s and early 1940s, as the swashbuckler image solidified and audiences continued to associate him with righteous rebellion, Flynn cultivated a life that seemed almost designed to test the limits of Hollywood's patience. He purchased a yacht, acquired property in Jamaica, and surrounded himself with a rotating constellation of friends, writers, adventurers, and socialites. The image of the pirate hero stepping off a soundstage and onto the deck of his own vessel blurred the line between fiction and reality, as though the man were determined to live inside the adventure he had perfected on screen. Stories circulated widely about parties that stretched until dawn, about music, laughter, and a refusal to recognize ordinary boundaries. Some accounts were documented in memoirs and interviews. Others survived only as industry folklore repeated in hushed tones across studio offices. What mattered was not always the factual precision of each tale, but the pattern they created. Flynn appeared restless, energized by motion, allergic to stillness. Where the studio preferred predictability and image control, he seemed to prefer appetite and improvisation. The same vitality that animated his swordplay now animated his nights, and while the camera could capture vitality without consequence, life beyond the set demanded a cost. Hollywood's machinery relied on discipline. Publicists shaped narratives, executives monitored reputations, and morality clauses in contracts existed precisely to prevent the kind of unpredictability that accompanied excess. Flynn's charm often softened friction, and colleagues frequently described him as magnetic and disarming, capable of turning tension into laughter. Yet charm could not erase headlines, nor could it fully insulate him from scrutiny as his lifestyle drew increasing attention. Reports of heavy drinking followed him persistently, and though not every rumor was verifiable, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. A widening gap between the hero who defended justice in Sherwood Forest and the man whose private life invited speculation. The sword under studio lights represented structure. It was choreographed, timed, polished, until every movement aligned with narrative purpose. The glass under moonlight, however, represented something less containable. It reflected spontaneity, indulgence, and a defiance of limitation that made Flynn both irresistible and volatile. To some observers, he embodied freedom in its purest form, a rejection of hypocrisy and restraint. To others, he seemed to be courting danger, testing how far charisma could stretch before it snapped. The industry, which had elevated him into a symbol of moral clarity, found itself confronting a more complicated reality, a leading man who would not live quietly for the sake of consistency. In these years, the tension intensified not because Flynn ceased to be successful, but because his success amplified the stakes. The brighter the spotlight, the sharper the contrast between crafted legend and lived experience. He remained capable of commanding the screen with confidence and grace, yet off-screen he cultivated a reputation that was increasingly difficult to separate from the roles he played. The hero image endured, but the shadow lengthened alongside it, and in that growing space between light and darkness lay the central paradox of his life. Hollywood had created a myth of controlled rebellion. Flynn insisted on practicing rebellion without control, and the difference between those two versions would eventually prove impossible to ignore. In 1943, at a time when World War II shaped public morality and Hollywood functioned as both entertainment and national morale machinery, Errol Flynn stepped into a role he had never rehearsed, a criminal defendant in a Los Angeles courtroom. He was formally charged under California law with statutory rape involving 2 teenage girls, accusations that immediately ignited nationwide headlines. The shock did not stem solely from the severity of the charges, but from the identity of the accused. Flynn was not merely an actor. He was the swashbuckling embodiment of justice, charm, and heroic defiance. The cultural dissonance was immediate and powerful. Newspapers published his image daily. Courtroom illustrations circulated widely. The proceedings unfolded less like a private legal matter and more like a public referendum on the integrity of a Hollywood legend. The trial itself was conducted under intense scrutiny. Testimony was examined line by line in print. Flynn's posture, facial expressions, and mannerisms were dissected with as much vigor as the legal arguments presented. Supporters emphasized inconsistencies in the prosecution's case and portrayed him as a target of exaggeration or opportunism. Critics argued that the allegations were an inevitable extension of a lifestyle long associated with excess and blurred boundaries. In that charged atmosphere, the courtroom became a symbolic battleground between two narratives, the romantic hero and the reckless celebrity. When the jury returned a verdict of not guilty in 1943, Flynn was legally cleared of wrongdoing. The courtroom erupted in relief among his defenders. Yet legal vindication did not restore cultural simplicity. Public perception rarely resets with a single verdict. During this period, the phrase "in like Flynn" entered popular slang, often used as a playful reference to sexual success. What is significant is not merely the phrase itself, but the way it subtly altered the layers of his public identity. Before the trial, Flynn represented adventure and righteous daring. Afterward, his name carried an additional undertone, one tinged with innuendo and ambiguity. The swashbuckler image endured, but it was no longer unshadowed. The studio system continued casting him in heroic roles, attempting to reinforce the familiar mythology. However, something intangible had shifted. The trial had exposed how fragile constructed legend could be when confronted with real-world accusation. Simultaneously, political suspicion added another dimension of instability. During World War II, federal authorities monitored numerous public figures, and later declassified records confirmed that Flynn was among those with files maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Surveillance did not equate to proof of espionage or criminal conspiracy, yet the mere existence of monitoring reflected the atmosphere of suspicion that defined the era. Allegations periodically surfaced, suggesting sympathy toward controversial European political figures. These claims were fueled more by association, travel, and speculation than by documented acts. Still, in a time shaped by ideological fear, ambiguity alone could corrode reputation. By 1959, shortly before his death, Flynn traveled to Cuba and conducted interviews with Fidel Castro during a volatile revolutionary moment. Admirers interpreted the trip as intellectual curiosity or journalistic daring. Skeptics viewed it through the lens of earlier suspicions. As with much of Flynn's life, interpretation depended heavily on perspective. What remained consistent was the pattern. Wherever he moved, controversy followed, whether grounded in fact, perception, or the space between them. The true fracture of 1943 was not legal but mythological. Flynn survived the courtroom, but the seamless unity between hero and man was permanently altered. On screen, he continued to wield the sword with confidence and cinematic grace. Off-screen, the glass reflected a world where charisma could not fully insulate consequence. From that point forward, every triumphant grin carried history behind it. The legend did not collapse, but it cracked, and through that crack, the shadow became inseparable from the light. By 1945, the world that had once embraced Errol Flynn's brand of heroic exuberance was no longer the same. The war had altered not only geopolitics but psychology, Audiences returning from battlefields and factory lines were no longer seeking purely romantic escapism. They were confronting trauma, disillusionment, and a harsher understanding of masculinity. The swashbuckler, radiant, agile, morally certain, belonged to a pre-war imagination. In the emerging post-war era, complexity replaced clarity. Heroes became brooding, conflicted, inward. The cultural tide was shifting, and even legends were not immune to its pull. Flynn continued to work, but the tone of his career subtly changed. The vitality that had once seemed inexhaustible began to show signs of strain. Reports of heavy drinking followed him persistently, and by the late 1940s, colleagues and journalists alike observed that the physical toll was becoming difficult to ignore. Physicians later remarked that his body appeared older than his years, worn down by excess and intensity. The man who had once vaulted across cinematic fortresses now moved with a weight that could not be hidden by costume or lighting. The sword still glittered under studio lamps, but the arm that wielded it carried fatigue. At the same time, Hollywood itself was evolving. The collapse of the studio system's rigid control structures, combined with shifting audience tastes, created space for a different type of male star. Performers like Marlon Brando emerged with a style rooted in psychological realism rather than theatrical bravado. Masculinity on screen grew quieter, more introspective, sometimes volatile in ways that felt internal rather than flamboyant. Flynn's charisma had always been kinetic, external, expansive. The new era favored compression. Where Flynn radiated outward, the post-war leading man turned inward. It was not a matter of talent lost, it was a matter of cultural tempo. Financial strain compounded the pressure. Flynn's lifestyle had long been generous to the point of extravagance, and as career momentum slowed, the imbalance between income and expenditure widened. Accounts describe investments that faltered and ventures that did not yield the security he might have expected. Yet there was little evidence that he intended to retreat into austerity. The appetite that had defined his youth did not quietly fade with age. If anything, the defiance remained, even as the physical resilience diminished. What makes this phase of Flynn's life particularly tragic is its gradualness. There was no singular catastrophic collapse, no single headline that marked the definitive end. Instead, there was erosion of stamina, of certainty, of the effortless invulnerability that once defined him. Interviews from this period occasionally reveal flashes of reflection, even irony, as though he understood the widening gap between the legend and the mirror. The myth demanded perpetual youth. Biology did not negotiate. The glass under moonlight grew heavier, more habitual, less celebratory. By the time he approached the late 1950s, the contrast between past and present was unmistakable. The industry had moved forward. Audiences had changed. The archetype he helped define was no longer central to Hollywood's imagination. And yet, even diminished, he retained a flicker of the force that had once electrified screens worldwide. That flicker, however, existed alongside visible decline. The sword symbolized a frozen moment of glory. The glass symbolized the cost of refusing to slow down. Between them lay a man confronting not only aging but the realization that cultural immortality does not halt physical consequence. The world had shifted, and Flynn, who once seemed to outrun everything, could no longer outrun time. In 1959, the year of his death, Errol Flynn published his autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways. The title alone functioned as both confession and performance. Rather than retreat from scandal, Flynn leaned into it, shaping his public memory with a voice that was candid, theatrical, and often ironic. The book did not read like an apology. It read like a man determined to narrate himself before history did it for him. If the courtroom had fractured the myth, the memoir attempted to reclaim authorship of that fracture. He acknowledged excess, flirted with notoriety, and framed his life as an adventure too large to be reduced to a single verdict or headline. This act of self-mythologizing was not merely vanity, it was strategic. Hollywood had once constructed him as an icon of righteous daring, but by the late 1950s, he understood that the era of uncomplicated heroes had passed. By telling his own story in his own cadence, humorous, defiant, occasionally reflective, Flynn preserved something essential: agency. He refused to be only the scandal of 1943, only the aging star, only the rumors that trailed him. In print, he remained kinetic. Even when describing decline, the tone carried bravado. The sword and the glass coexisted on the page, neither fully victorious over the other. Yet the body could not be narrated into renewal. In October 1959, while in Vancouver, Flynn suffered a heart attack and died at age 50. Physicians who examined him remarked that his physical condition reflected years of strain beyond what his age suggested. The contrast was stark. The man who once seemed immortal under Technicolor lights had been overtaken by time in ordinary daylight. News of his death circulated quickly, and obituaries struggled to contain the contradiction. Was he a reckless hedonist who burned out by choice, or a gifted performer trapped between public fantasy and private appetite? The answer depended, as it always had, on perspective. In death, the legend did not fade. It crystallized. Film historians continue to cite Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood as definitive statements of the swashbuckler archetype. Generations of actors inherited the template he helped define: the athletic grace, the ironic grin, the balance between danger and charm. Even as Hollywood evolved toward psychological realism, Flynn's silhouette remained embedded in the grammar of adventure cinema. The sword he lifted on screen became part of the genre's visual vocabulary. At the same time, his off-screen persona fed another lineage, the bad boy archetype that romanticizes defiance and excess. Later stars who blurred the line between charisma and controversy often found themselves compared, implicitly or explicitly, to Flynn. He became a cautionary emblem as much as an aspirational one. The duality proved durable, brilliance intertwined with risk, magnetism shadowed by vulnerability. In that duality lies the reason his story endures. He was never simple. Ultimately, Errol Flynn represents a collision between constructed immortality and human limitation. The studio lights promised eternity, the body insisted on consequence. The courtroom exposed fragility. The memoir asserted control. The sword symbolized mythic heroism. The glass reflected mortal appetite. Between those symbols stands a man who refused moderation, who embraced spectacle, who understood that legend requires audacity, and who paid for that audacity in increments too subtle to notice until they became irreversible. The world moved on. Hollywood changed. Masculinity evolved. Yet, when audiences revisit those early films and watch him leap across a fortress wall, time briefly folds in on itself. For a moment, the fracture disappears. For a moment, the hero and the man seem unified again. And perhaps that fleeting unity, fragile, luminous, unsustainable, is the truest measure of his legacy. Cinema preserves youth with merciless precision. The leap remains suspended. The smile never trembles. The blade never dulls. When we watch Errol Flynn vault across fortress walls in The Adventures of Robin Hood, time appears defeated. The image does not age. The hero does not hesitate. The myth remains intact. But the body did. That is the tension we rarely sit with long enough. We celebrate the sword, the clarity, the heroism, the effortless masculinity. We replay the triumphs. We quote the lines, yet the glass sits quietly beside it, holding the cost of that brightness. Excess, defiance, appetite, fatigue. The private negotiations that never make it into the final cut. Legends are not undone in a single dramatic fall. They erode slowly, invisibly, while the audience continues applauding a version of them that no longer exists. So what do we choose to remember? Do we remember the scandal of 1943? Do we remember the political suspicion, the surveillance files, the rumors? Do we remember the heart that gave out at 50? Or do we remember the leap? Perhaps the real measure of a legend is not purity, but impact. Not perfection, but imprint. Flynn's sword shaped the language of adventure cinema. His grin defined an era of masculine confidence. His excess warned future stars of the fine line between charisma and combustion. He was luminous and cracked. Both truths can coexist. And maybe that is the quiet lesson beneath the spectacle. Hollywood builds immortality out of light, but light cannot cancel consequence. We are drawn to brilliance, even when it burns too hot. We admire audacity, even when it carries risk. Flynn lived as though moderation were a foreign language. The industry changed. The body weakened. The myth endured. When the film rolls, he is forever midair. When the lights come up, we are left with the question, is greatness worth the fracture? If this story made you reconsider what it means to be a hero, stay with us, because Hollywood is full of legends who glittered and paid,